days.
All right.
Appreciate it.
Thank you, Corey. Great introduction. Thank you all for being here today on a warm summer day. Can everyone hear me okay? I wrote this book, Wonderlandscape, and wanted to be talking to people about it as partly as a celebration of its paperback release just last 2 months ago. But what we wanted to do today, to talk about, and hopefully well, I will just advance it manually. Yeah. Perfect. Thank you. I wanted to talk about the National Park Service, founded 110 years ago, and how that has affected Yellowstone. And so Yellowstone, I mean, we all live really close by, right? And yet the word has different meanings. Yellowstone is a place. As a place, it is ancient, as a set of ecological processes, as a ecosystem containing many wonderful animals and geological features. And yet as a park, that's another definition of the word Yellowstone, referring to the actual national park founded in 1872. And then our unusual political history is that we had Yellowstone National Park for over 40 years before we had an agency to manage national parks. And so the National Park Service was created 110 years ago this month on August 25th, 1916. And so given that it was August, I decided, wouldn't it be interesting to sort of look at that event and the ripples that have played out from that? How has the establishment of that agency affected Yellowstone as a place, Yellowstone as a park, Yellowstone as a tourist experience? Of course, there's one more definition of Yellowstone, and that refers to the Kevin Costner TV show. And I'm not really going to talk much about that today. I don't think it has a whole lot to do with Yellowstone as a park. So when we think about 1916, 110 years ago, Yellowstone as a place had been here for a while. Yellowstone as a park had been here for a while. And you guys, I trust being mostly local, know a lot of this. By the way, do we have any people from out of town here today? At least one? And I know we have a couple people from Red Lodge. Thank you to my groupies for coming down. So yeah, you guys are going to be familiar with this. I'll try to get through this pretty quickly. The geysers have been there for a very long time. The canyon and the falls, some of the spectacular geology. This is Devil's Slide north of the park. The opportunities for camping and being outside. The incredible indigenous history of this place. The architecture, things like the Old Faithful Inn, built in 1902, 1903, so before the Park Service existed. Yellowstone as a place was very much, very vibrant. And of course it had the incredible wildlife resources that have been there for so long. But then in 1916, we also have the establishment of the National Park Service. And so this was a new branch of the Department of Interior, responding to a lot of sort of national trends, or even international trends, especially with regards to tourism. There was a big movement in the first couple decades of the 20th century called See America First, Once trains were able to take you to many places in America, including Cody, Wyoming, as automobiles grew as an effective method of transportation, long-distance transportation, more people wanted to explore America. And with the advent of war in Europe in, 1914, World War I starts, a lot of people who used to go to Europe on vacation decided they should see America first. And some of the tourist infrastructure lobbying organizations of the time, railroads and automobile clubs especially, started taking advantage of that and pushing the idea of see America first. And yet, when you got to a national park, was it really going to be ready for you? After Yellowstone in 1872, a few more national parks had been founded. Yosemite, 1890, I believe it was, Sequoia, General Grant, Mount Rainier, Grand Canyon. These parks come along sort of one by one. Oh, this is a special landscape. We should preserve this. But there wasn't a lot of discussion about how to manage it. What would be the objectives of a national park? What would be the standards of a national park? Would cars be allowed into national parks? What types of hotels or other accommodations would be allowed? None of this was, even who would manage it, right? Yellowstone at that point was being managed by the military. The military had been useful in the 1880s to keep poachers out, to sort of manage this huge expanse of land. There weren't a lot of agencies in the federal government familiar with that sort of high-level management. And yet other parks were managed by the Forest Service or by the Department of Interior. It was all sort of confusing. And so Steve Mather, a millionaire, what today we would call a billionaire, he had made a whole bunch of money and decided to do something good for the country. He decided to help start this National Park Service. He was assisted by Horace Albright, a young guy just out of college, very organized. And Albright later became the first civilian superintendent of Yellowstone. So we have here the original National Park Service logo focusing on the eagle, and then the current logo focusing on the bison, very much tied to Yellowstone. So Yellowstone, between the bison, between Albright's role here, was essential to the National Park Service. And yet, there were many other national concerns affecting the Park Service, so it wasn't just going to be, yeah, we'll replicate Yellowstone everywhere. It was going to be, we're going to create this agency and change some stuff. And so the question we're thinking about today, given that we're here with the Draper Natural History Museum, oops, wrong direction. How is that going to affect natural history? And as I asked that question, I'm like, let's make sure we know what we mean by the phrase natural history. And so, according to Merriam-Webster, a treatise on some aspect of nature, the study of natural objects, especially in the field from an amateur or popular point of view. So a lot of the 19th century naturalists, the John Muirs and John Burroughses, were just going out into the woods and looking at the animals and what they did and how they lived and learning from that. It was a less laboratory-oriented, less professional scientific-oriented kind of discipline, a natural historian. Just to confirm, I went to Wikipedia for a different definition, and they said, yeah, there's a broad range of definitions. The scientific study of individual organisms in their environment, both cultural and natural components of the world. And so this was where I started getting interested. I am not a scientist myself. Some people call me a natural historian, okay. I'm really more of a cultural historian. I'm interested in how the culture has evolved and how that has affected people's values, people's lives, and also how it has affected nature. And so, and then just to finally confirm from the Draper website, landscapes, wildlife, and plant life of the Greater Yellowstone region, and how human presence shapes their world. And so obviously human presence has been shaping Yellowstone as a place. It shaped the formation of Yellowstone as a park. The question we look at today, did the establishment of the Park Service shape natural history in some ways? Obviously the Park Service, interested in keeping nature, preserving nature, celebrating nature, were they always successful in that? Were the Park Service and natural history allies or rivals? As writers, we always like conflict, and so I went to see if I could find any conflict in this combination of the Park Service and natural history. Any questions so far? Okay. So let me talk about one factor that the Park Service really brought into the picture, and that's patriotism. The top photo here, that's Horace Albright, the first civilian superintendent of Yellowstone, very much a creature of the Park Service, a co-author of the legislation that established the Park Service. This is Ann Albright, a journalist who's going to write a story about Yellowstone. And this is Charles Cook, an early explorer. He was on the 1869 Folsom Cook expedition, one of the first set of white people to come into Yellowstone. Cook was a resident of White Sulphur Springs, Montana, wanted to come out here on vacation, came back to civilization and was like, you would not believe what I saw. And people said, yeah, we don't really believe you. Who the hell are you? And so they sent out some more famous people and more scientifically connected people in 1870 and 1871. And eventually the Hayden expedition of 1871 led to the establishment of the park the following spring. But in 1922, for the 50th anniversary of the park, Charles Cook was still alive and was willing to come to an event in Yellowstone. And Horace Albright was very excited about this and planned a whole event centered at, can anyone tell where they are? This is Madison Junction, the confluence of the Gibbon and Firehole Rivers over towards West Yellowstone. And this is the place that was, Albright kept insisting, the birthplace of the national park idea. And so here along the confluence of the Madison is a reenactment of the 1870 expedition in Yellowstone. The relatively more famous people, mostly from Helena, who came to Yellowstone to confirm what Cook had said. And they entered at Mammoth Hot Springs at Gardner, and they went down and they saw the canyon and they saw Old Faithful, and then they exited at West Yellowstone, heading out towards Virginia City. But on their last night, camped in what is now the park here on the shores of the river, a lawyer named Cornelius Hedges allegedly said, we should preserve this place as a park. They were sitting around a campfire debating what should happen to this place. Should we all file homestead claims? Should we sort of coordinate so we can build a tourist resort of some sort? And Hedges said, no, this should belong to the people as a whole. Horace Albright loved this story. Horace Albright told this story every chance he could. That's why he brought Cook and Albright to Madison Junction in 1922, so he could have another chance to tell the story of how Yellowstone was the birthplace of the national park idea, of this whole idea of having national parks. It was the first national park. It's sort of funny how this campfire tale wasn't really very well known in the 1870s when it happened, or the 1880s. Or the 1890s. Finally, in the mid-1890s, somebody wrote a book that included this tale of what Hedges had said and how this represented the birthplace of an idea. That notion of the campfire myth, it's now called, because we're not sure if it really happened, that grew and grew, especially thanks to Albright and Mather, who knew the value of a great origin story. Right? Mather, when he'd been a borax executive, had told a great origin story of how they mined borax in the Death Valley, and it took a 20-mule team wagon to get it out of there. It was so remote and so hot that they needed 20 mules to carry, mostly to carry the water to feed them as they were trying to carry the borax out. That origin story became the key marketing feature of Mather's campaign to promote his brand of borax versus other brands of borax. And so here was the origin story for the National Park Service. The origin story happened to be located in Yellowstone. It happened to be taking advantage of a component of Yellowstone that people hadn't paid much attention to. Madison Junction, very beautiful place. People would stop there. I'm sure there was, at that point, a campground there like there is now. But under Albright and his successors, Yellowstone really promoted this campfire myth at Madison Junction. Some of you may have seen, well, we'll get to that in the next slide, 2 slides from now. Mather and Albright needed to have the wider public have a great affection for the Park Service because they needed the tax revenues to support their agency. They wanted people to contact their congressman and say, yes, I went to Yellowstone, it was wonderful, please continue to fund it. And so that's why they pushed this birth of the national park idea. They also thus pushed the idea that wildlife is a national treasure. Wildlife is a symbol of the greatness of America. Yellowstone had already been the place where the bison had been saved from extinction. But under Mather and Albright, that whole story became a story of America, not just a story of science, not just a story of natural history, as it were, but a cultural touchstone. And so patriotism was a huge component of the National Park Service. And thanks to the Park Service's interest in patriotism, Yellowstone became a place of patriotism as well. Another area that the Park Service had impact on Yellowstone was automobiles. The very first automobiles arrived in Yellowstone on July 31st, 1915. So that's 1 year before the founding of the Park Service. But it's 6 months after Mather started work at the Department of Interior organizing this new agency. It was part of Mather's effort to standardize everything. Let's make sure that every park allows automobiles inside. It was part of Mather's effort to draw tourists from all over the place. Mather was very much coordinating with the automobile lobbyists, with the automobile industry. Mather was, I like to say that he was nationalizing tourism. And, you know, the word nationalize can have a couple of definitions here as well. You can think of nationalizing in terms of Yellowstone is no longer just a regional or local destination. It's one that people from all around the country can come to. And indeed, the first tourist to legally enter the park was driving a Model T Ford all the way from Minnesota. And yet, of course, nationalized, we also think of, like, in terms of communism and the old Soviet Union would nationalize factories by taking them over and running them with the government. And that's not exactly what happens in America, and yet it is sort of funny that these big tourist destinations are actually owned by the federal government. And so to some extent, tourism is being nationalized as it is growing in the early 20th century, and Yellowstone is very much a center of that. But more importantly, automobiles clearly changed the tourist experience in Yellowstone. Before automobiles, you would take a 5-day stagecoach tour where everything you saw was sort of dictated by whatever your tour guide wanted you to see. You would be suffering through that tour guide's bad jokes or perhaps scientifically inaccurate views of natural history. And after automobiles, you could drive yourself. You could define nature for yourself. You could define what you thought was interesting, what you wanted to look at, and how you wanted to interpret it. And so this picture is of President Franklin Roosevelt observing the Old Faithful geyser. So this is mid-1930s, 1936, I think. And of course, you could never drive a car that close to Old Faithful today, nor could you have so few people around. And of course, today we know that Franklin Roosevelt was disabled, was very unlikely to get out of his car, especially in public. And so they probably made vast accommodations for him. How can he see Yellowstone from the back seat of his car? There's another terrific picture of him looking out at the Grand Canyon of the Yellowstone from his car and with no other people around. Sort of extraordinary. But at the time, when they didn't know, when Roosevelt was hiding his disability, the implication of this picture was, yes, this is the way to see Yellowstone. This is the way everyone sees Yellowstone, from their car. And so Yellowstone really became very much of a car-centric place. This is also the Roosevelt Party driving through Yellowstone. Of course, we are going to see Yellowstone by car. We're going to see it by convertible. And of course, we are going to stop and feed the bears. Again, the Roosevelt Party in the mid-1930s. I just published an essay on my Substack this week about the bear feeding and how incredibly popular it was from the 1920s into the 1960s. And I had people commenting that they had no idea that this was the way many Yellowstone visitors experienced bears back then. Especially with the advent of automobiles, you could retreat to your automobile and feel safe, wisely or not, or you could come out and feed candy to the bears, and this was the way you were experiencing nature. And so we had a whole bunch of new John Muirs coming to Yellowstone and observing the bears in their natural environment, except their natural environment involved the automobiles and involved the people feeding them, often feeding them candy, because that was something that the National Park Service had encouraged, almost required Yellowstone Park to change its management procedures to encourage people to enjoy nature by interacting with creatures. You know, historians always urge us to avoid presentism, to not judge people of the past by the standards of today. People back then may not have known as much about ecology, might not have known as much about sort of the value of the wildness of a bear. And yet, the historical record suggests that the managers, such as Albright, probably did know that this type of behavior was going to affect bear mortality, that some of these bears were going to end up attacking people and being euthanized for that. It was, for that matter, it was going to affect some people who would be injured by those bear encounters. And yet, when you had this national agency involved in the management of the park, you had a bunch of national politics affecting the way you make these natural history decisions. The other interesting thing that the cars brought was a sort of democratization of Yellowstone. Back in the stagecoach days, you had to be really wealthy to afford the 5-day tour after several days of train travel to get there. And when you could bring your own car, you could bring your own tents, and many people just camped wherever the hell they wanted. And so this is, I believe, at Mammoth in the 1920s. And the sign, you probably can't read at this resolution, but it says something to the effect of, you know, hey, we're from Indiana. Any other Indianans want to come over and let's have a party? And so there were a bunch of upper class nature lovers who were absolutely horrified by the sort of almost homeless camp type environment that cars were encouraging. And so we have the beginnings, or maybe the continuations of sort of class divides over nature. The Indianans were really, really happy to be out in nature, enjoying nature, camping, enjoying their national park. And yet some of the natural historians were like, oh, this is, I'm not really sure we like this. So automobiles bring in a fascinating set of tensions to national parks. And again, I think that's really tied to the Park Service. Another big thing for the Park Service was interpretation. When you were on a stagecoach tour, your guide would tell you what you were looking at. When you were in your own automobile, how were you going to know? So let me start with this picture on the bottom left. Does anyone recognize this roadside exhibit? At Obsidian Cliff, between Mammoth and Norris, I believe. Obsidian Cliff, where the Indians had, had gotten pieces of obsidian to use in their arrowheads. Obsidian has been found as far east as Ohio, I believe, and so a great example of the rich culture that existed back then. But, you know, if you're driving by it in a car, are you going to know what it is or what it means? And so the Park Service built these roadside exhibits. The one at Obsidian Cliff was the first roadside exhibit anywhere in a national park in the United States. Looking up at the top picture, this is the construction of the roadside museum at Madison Junction. We were talking earlier about Madison Junction being the birthplace of the national park idea, and so they decided to build a museum to honor that. This is Herman Carey Bumpus, the former director of the Natural History Museum in New York. He's standing next to Kenneth Chorley of the Rockefeller Foundation. The Rockefellers really gave a lot of money towards this effort of helping people understand nature right in the place where it's happening. And then Herbert Mayer, who was the architect who designed this building and several other buildings. A really incredible innovation. I know when I go to the park, and perhaps for you guys too, one of the things that I really enjoy are these roadside museums that still exist at Norris, at Fishing Bridge, and here at Madison. The one at Madison is sort of a strange place now because it was built to honor this campfire myth that the historians now are not really sure is true. So the one at Madison is just a really cool building on the side of that meadow. But the ones at Norris and Fishing Bridge, for me, are just sort of a delightful way of, boy, I just experienced these geysers or these fish, and now I'm going to learn about it right here before I forget the wonder. And so the education can be tied to the wonder. At the time, because it was the Park Service and it was a big centralized bureaucracy, there were lots of people who were arguing, no, there should be one museum, one big museum in Mammoth. or maybe even a big museum in some nearby city, or even a big museum in Washington to tell us about the parks. And Bumpus and Mayer said, no, we want people to be learning about nature right there, right where nature is. That's the best way to interpret. And so it was very successful. Again, this was Yellowstone and Yosemite led the Park Service's efforts in interpretation. Now you can see interpretive signs at lots of places. Here's another one from Yellowstone, a White Dome geyser. But of course, you also see them, in places like Bighorn Canyon. You have plenty of interpretation because under the Park Service, that's the way we are expected to appreciate nature. John Muir went out alone and just sort of looked at things, and we get this added value of all that science has learned in the past several hundred years about nature. One of the funny things I found in digging up this story was that Herman Carey Bumpus had recently returned from Europe, where he'd been driving around in rural France, and he had seen lots of roadside shrines. And as I understand it, they were literal religious shrines where people were honoring the teachings of the Catholic Church at some location for some reason. And so Bumpus really wanted to call these places shrines. And there was a lot of discomfort in the Park Service. Again, big federal agency, lots of politics, lots of conflicting views, lots of people who aren't quite sure about the value of religion, lots of people who are wondering about the tensions between science and religion. And so instead they got called kiosks. But I really wonder, what would it have been like if all of these roadside interpretive spaces and signs had been called shrines? How might we think about nature differently today with those shrines, tying it more specifically to spiritual values than we do now? Again, those were decisions that were in the National Park Service that I think have affected Yellowstone and its natural history today. The other interesting thing about interpretation and these signs is that, of course, any agency faces some struggle, some debate, some conflicting goals, because you also need to control populations, especially as they grow, especially as you have more and more tourists today. And so you have, where was I? And so you have signs that are telling people what to do, not just signs that are helping people appreciate. I've been involved in helping to design some of the interpretive signs we have around Red Lodge, and boy, I really feel this tension. It's like, yeah, let's not always be telling people, don't do this, don't do this, don't do this. Let's be encouraging their wonder and not just sort of forcing them to do what somebody wants them to do. So a fascinating tension that I think has been playing out for decades in Yellowstone, thanks to the Park Service. How are we doing on time? Looks like we're doing pretty good. So that's just one example of some of the management challenges that the Park Service has faced in Yellowstone over the last 110 years. The scope of tourist conflicts has risen with the rise in tourism. And so here's, a bear breaking into a car. And that is, clearly at least a 60 or 80-year-old picture. And bear tensions have continued. One of the fun things I did in Wonderlandscape was to chart Yellowstone visitation, not just in raw terms, but as a percentage of the U.S. population. So obviously Yellowstone visitation has grown over the last 150 years. Obviously the population has grown, but how have they grown in comparison? And so you see early on there's very few visitors. Then after cars are admitted in 1915, it starts rising pretty significantly. There's a drop with the Depression, a huge drop during World War II, and then absolutely skyrocketing visitation in the late 40s, 50s, 60s. And then it sort of levels off. And again, visitation rose, but it didn't rise much faster than the US population. And so for those of us who first experienced Yellowstone in the 80s or 90s, it was almost like a relative lull. We had it so great that we had this vast park with many fewer people than we might have otherwise. And this chart, of course, stops, the data I found stopped in 1996, and I'm sure now it would be skyrocketing again. So that's basically what this is implying, that the raw visitation numbers are not measuring foreign versus domestic. And so I think we're seeing a lot more foreign visitors in the last 20, 30 years. If I've got time, I'd love to tell a story about pelicans that I think a lot of people are not familiar with. I certainly wasn't until I stumbled across it a few years ago. In the 1920s, Horace Albright engaged in a campaign to kill pelicans because pelicans ate too many trout. Pelicans, as our natural historians will tell us, they eat a phenomenal amount of food. It's something like 5% of their body weight every day. They eat a ton of fish. Most of the time they're eating fish that people aren't really interested in, but they're very opportunistic. If they see a bunch of trout, they will eat a bunch of trout. And Albright was concerned that they were eating too many trout, and so he instructed his rangers to go out and kill them. The scientists, the ecologists, the natural historians complained. This feels like meddling in nature. This doesn't seem like a good idea. But it really, the pro-pelican movement really took off thanks to a woman named Rosalie Edge, who was a wealthy New York City bird watcher, had never even visited Yellowstone, but was very passionate about birds and science, especially predatory birds. She founded Hawk Mountain in Pennsylvania, the first refuge for predatory birds anywhere in the country. And she learned about this story in Yellowstone and sent it out in her newsletter. It was, sort of that day's equivalent of Twitter or something, alerting all sorts of activists all over the country to this horrible thing that Albright was doing. And Albright, again, we think about the National Park Service as this federal bureaucracy. He had decided that, yes, maybe it was a good idea to reverse his policy. And he had said, okay, we're going to stop killing pelicans. But he tried to keep it quiet because he didn't want to be embarrassed about the fact that he had once killed them. And when Edge took it public, he had to go public as well and say, yes, thank you for bringing this up. Actually, we have already addressed this. We have stopped killing pelicans. We believe in the value of all animals in Yellowstone. We believe in the value of predators, even though we really love these animals that they treat as prey. And of course, this is the set of values that would be eventually applied to wolves and grizzly bears and other predators that Yellowstone is going to admire and protect. Wolves, even though we really love the elk that they often kill. It started with pelicans, and it started with a woman, a New York City bird watcher, taking advantage of the ways that bureaucracies work to really bring about much more effectively her own values, which proved to be the ecological values that many of us have today. And so likewise, I think we're seeing a change in the meaning of wildlife, human attitudes towards wildlife, our interest in predators and ecosystems, and not just particularly pretty trout or elk or something like that. We feel more, we have more interest today than we did 110, 120 years ago in the lives of the animals. And that gets reflected in the values of the agency itself. The Park Service will have white papers, issue statements about, yes, this is how the agency feels about ecosystems, about nature, about natural history. And that ends up rippling down to Yellowstone and shaping Yellowstone's values. And so those are 4 brief ways that areas of effect that the National Park Service has had on Yellowstone and on natural history in Yellowstone. Again, these were things that the topics that I was fortunate to explore in Wonderlandscape, and given the anniversary this month, decided to talk about them with you guys today. This is by no means a comprehensive look at the subject, but just sort of honoring my interest in the intersection between natural history and cultural history. I thought these areas might be hopefully thought-provoking. Certainly were for me as I put this together. Maybe they are for you too. And so I'd love to hear if you guys have any questions or comments or your own stories that you'd like to share. Okay.
What's on?
Oh, great.